Well, I want to thank you all for being here this afternoon. Obviously, there's a lot of great programming taking place, so all of us on stage appreciate your time and attention. Just to kind of give you a rundown of what to expect today, we'll do about 45 minutes of discussion talking through water supply conundrums facing California, collect some wisdom from our three brilliant panelists, and use the remaining time for Q&A. By the end, my hope is that you'll be able to take home a new insight, something actionable that can answer that ensuing question of what now. So with that, let's meet our panel. Starting right here on my left, Alvar Escriva-Bou is an assistant professor with UCLA's Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering and Institute of the Environment and Sustainability. He's one of the top minds on groundwater issues and helped the author a PPIC report last month that spelled out how the San Joaquin Valley can adapt as water scarcity remains the norm. Please give a round of applause for Alvar. Sitting in the middle is Heather Cooley, Director of Research at the Pacific Institute. That's a think tank dedicated to investigating the world's most pressing water challenges. She was the lead author last year on a report that laid out how urban areas can dramatically increase water supply through efficiency, reuse, and stormwater capture. Please give a hand for Heather. And then finally, Greg Pierce wears a lot of hats for UCLA. He's the co-executive director of the Luskin Center for Innovation and director of the Human Right to Water Solutions Lab. He's doing such important work on water affordability and access. Maybe you saw his ticking time bomb quote in an LA Times piece recently that set the stage for an eye-opening look at our failing water systems. Please give a hand to Greg. So I want to briefly just turn the clock back to 1978. It was a dramatic year in the state's political scene. San Francisco Supervisor Harvey Milk and Mayor George Moscone were assassinated. Their board president, Dianne Feinstein, who announced the killings, became mayor and never looked back. Anti-tax fervor led to the polarizing and probably ever problematic passage of Proposition 13. And Jerry Brown was reelected to his second term as governor. State lawmakers were thinking about water supply. The legislature sent a joint resolution, and this is both houses, urging the White House and federal agencies to support a $60 million, that's a lot of money in 1978, to tow icebergs from Antarctica to Southern California. For some reason, Jimmy Carter didn't bite. Fast forward to today, the stakes are pretty serious. In drought years, communities in the San Joaquin Valley, North Coast, and elsewhere are running out of water. Despite a landmark groundwater law, wells are drying up, especially in overlooked Latino communities. Dams don't have enough water to generate electricity. Many farmers are buckling. Snowpack is disappearing. Special interests and warring factions are suffocating so much of the discourse. So, as we've heard today and this morning, we kind of get a sense of what the stakes are. Today, we're going to talk about policy solutions and innovations that, with political will and investment, could make a difference in the difficult years ahead. So, Heather, I want to start with you. This week, Calmatters reported that state regulators finally unveiled conservation mandates that would require water suppliers serving 95% of the population to consume less. Forcing cities and local agencies to figure out a constellation of new strategies. Most urban areas are actually on track to reach these recurring 5-year targets already, which kind of just begs the question, are these mandates enough?
Yeah, great question. So let me take a step back and start, and acknowledge in many of our urban areas, in fact, across the state, we are using less water today than we have in the past, despite population growth, despite economic growth. And that's because of water conservation and efficiency. We have made investments in taking out old appliances and fixtures, starting the transition of our landscapes, and those have made a real difference. It's enabled us, again, to grow and use less water. We, though, still have droughts, increasingly severe droughts. We're facing a hotter, drier future. We also have been overtapping on groundwater and have been taking too much out of our rivers and streams. And so there is a desperate need to do more. Back in 2007, there was a policy, Senate Bill 7X7, and that was to reduce urban water use by 20% by 2020. And that was, again, focused on urban water suppliers. There are separate efforts around ag, and I'm sure we will talk about that.
Oh, we will.
So, what we found, and many at the time thought we can't do it. This is too hard. We've already made these investments. We've gotten the low-hanging fruit. And lo and behold, we did it. In fact, we exceeded the 20% reduction by 2020. Part of that was because of the drought. 2012 to 2015 drought was very severe. And again, California stepped up and dramatically reduced their use. As we approached 2020, and there was some criticism of 2020 because many felt and said, well, we've been doing a lot for a long time. Some haven't been doing anything. That's not fair. 20%, I'm at 100 gallons. Other communities are at 200 gallons, 300 gallons per day. So as we began to look forward again to 2025 and 2030 and 2035, what do we do? How do we keep driving efficiency? There was a request by water suppliers to come up with a different approach and to really develop an efficiency standard. And through this standard, there will be individual objectives for urban water suppliers to reduce their use. And it'll be in varying amounts. For those that have already done a lot, the amount required will be relatively small. For those who haven't, it's more. And so those were just released. And as you noted, a large number of water suppliers in California aren't going to have to do much to meet this standard. And some are going to have to cut by 20, even 30%. To the question of whether it's enough, this is a standard. It's meant to sort of be the floor, is how I look at it. Many communities are going to have to do more because of the climate change and the impacts on water, because of our needs to protect and restore ecosystems. So it won't be enough in that it's going to solve all of our problems, but I do think it's a good floor and provides kind of a foundation and
Yeah, Greg, what do you think about this? I mean, Scottsdale, Arizona banned lawns on all new single-family homes this year. Is that kind of mandate something California should enact?
I don't think we're there yet, but I do think the bans have been discussed, and I think some places are going to implement on quote unquote non-functional turf for grass in public areas, especially in public buildings. So medians are somewhere we should be going everywhere in California. And I do think even with these standards that we're talking about right now, and that I personally know were instituted, we're gonna have to go further in the future on conservation. Plenty of other areas have gone much further than we've gone, even though we've come a long way. But no, I don't think we're to the point of banning installation of lawns. That's a fairly new policy, I think maybe another.
Yeah, just a couple months ago.
It's been done in Nevada and Arizona, but just in the last 2 years. So again, I don't think we should do that. Maybe localities should do that, but certainly not statewide.
Yeah. Alvar, as you know, obviously farms use roughly 40% of California's water. Agriculture has largely done everything it's been asked, adopting drip irrigation, adhering to regulations, accepting reluctantly smaller water deliveries in dry years. Years like this one will increasingly become rarer. I mean, what is the next phase of adaptation for agriculture?
Thanks so much for the question, and thanks for inviting me. So that's a really good question, and actually, I would say that's even harder than for cities. Just following up on the previous conversations, cities have been doing a great job in the past 20, 30 years. And we've seen that in between the 2012-16 drought and the 2020-22 drought, we have seen really, really small problems in the state, in cities. And that it's a point that cities have been actually doing their homework, and they have been investing in conservation, efficiency, but also in alternative supplies. The ag situation is much more complex. The situation is that we have been using more water than we have for 100 years in California, especially in the San Joaquin Valley, especially also in the Central Coast, in some other places. And while in cities, it's relatively easier for cities to pay for new infrastructure. Farmers just have the money to invest depending on how much they make. And you know that farmers don't make a lot of money per acre foot of water. So what happens is that they don't have a lot of options to bring new supplies. For example, a lot of people talks about desalination. Desalination, it's not an option for farmers in California. Seawater desalination. There's some places that can be used groundwater.
We'll get to that, yeah, for sure.
But so what happens? The only solution actually is that we are going to see a relatively sizable and important decrease in water use, and that means actually putting current farms into other uses. And that's actually the best solution that you can do if you think that farmers want to make also money from other places. So there's other options right now. There's solar development. So we could have two policies at the same time, reducing water use, at the same time increasing energy efficiency and renewables in the state. We could also think about other options like using some lands that are, for example, annexed to the rivers or current wetlands or stuff. So providing public money for public benefits. So if farmers actually, we could provide incentives for farmers to actually use these lands. I mean, to allow these farms to be used to recreational benefits, to environmental benefits. And there's other options that we have been studying, but the reality is that in the next 20 years, mandated by Sigma, but also because climate change is here, there's many. The reality of this variability of water, water that we have in California, it's no longer. Everybody knows that, and farmers are feeling that. So the reality is that we are going to see a reduction, maybe 10, 15% of farm acreage in the state. And the best we can do, it's actually try to incentivize farmers to make the right decisions and to try to provide additional incomes from other ways while reducing water use.
I was just going to add, I think too, as Alvar noted, the amount of water available for ag is going to go down. We've been living beyond our means, particularly with groundwater. And so, it's going to be a combination of factors that farmer and agriculture are going to have to do to adapt. I think efficiency, moving towards drip irrigation and micro sprinklers will be one of those, moving away from flood irrigation or overhead sprinklers. It's going to be building soil health so that you can hold on to that water when it is available and when it's applied. It's going to be recharge. One of the issues we are also dealing with are temperatures and more intense, rainfall events is a risk of flooding. And there are already some really innovative projects happening to try to take some of that water, not all of that water, but to take some of that water and spread it on land, agricultural land, permanently, to recharge the aquifers. That's the one sort of silver lining, and we're to do good if there's some storage there that we can take advantage of for some of these challenges. And then, we are going to have to farm less land. And I think that's, some of the work that Alvar and colleagues have been looking at is how do we help support some of these communities transition their economy from one that's over-reliant or dependent on excessive use of water beyond what's available towards something that's more sustainable and resilient. And so it's a tough problem, and it's going to take a lot of different folks to find solutions.
Yeah, absolutely. Greg, I want to get you in on this one too. I mean, obviously in an increasingly scarce future with these extremely dry periods, then kind of these big bouts of random wetness. I mean, where does agriculture go next in this next phase? I mean, what would you add to that?
I mean, not much, honestly, except I think I agree with both my fellow panelists, but they can correct me if I'm wrong. Just to note, again, I think the number is still agriculture uses 8% of the water in the state. So that's the context we're coming from. I see the people nodding their heads both directions, so maybe we can fix that Q&A. If you're, certainly in terms of human use, that's roughly true. If you're counting the environment, which I don't think you should, the number changes. But yeah, I think efficiency still needs to improve. It's tough to improve, especially if you're a small farmer. Voluntary trading, which obviously San Diego is the best example of, and we thought we would see more of, but it's slow in the coming is a big part of the equation. And moving to higher value crops is definitely part of the economic equation, as well as, as a last resort, I think following and transitioning farms entirely. But again, I defer to maybe what Alvar is about to say on this.
Yeah, go for it, Alvar.
No, I agree with my panelists too. I just wanted to bring a positive note because I was also seeing people. And you asked us of being positive. And actually, we just published a report February this year. And, there's a lot of talk, this is kind of the end of agriculture in California. And I want to bring the positive and no, this is not. We are talking maybe 10, 15%. That's important, of course. There will be a lot of communities affected. As Heather was pointing out, recharge is, I started that train of thought that there's not many options available for farmers, but actually recharge is cheap. And you can use your own irrigation infrastructure to do recharge. There's a lot of efforts going on right now in the state, especially because this last year was really wet, and because there's one policy need here. We actually realized that, we are not doing recharge at the way that we should do it, especially with this changing climate. But finally, the last point I wanted to make on this positive note is that farmers in California have been increasing their value of production for the past 40 years. It's, they have been innovating, they have been bringing new products, they have been changing their crops, doing wire trading. And this is going to keep doing, this is going to keep happening in the next 20 years. And we did this report in February that even with the reductions in water use that we expect in the next 20 years, we expect that because of increasing yields, increased productivity, they can actually increase economic output. And that's, it's, of course, it's not what everyone would like. Everyone would like to keep farming what they were doing, but we can adapt and we can still being the major food producer in the state and being a major agricultural powerhouse.
Yeah, I noticed like before this panel that the Department of Food and Ag in the state noted that the agriculture sector itself has actually increased sales. I mean, the margins are growing as a sector, right? The harm is more at an individual level, right? It's who is able to adapt and who isn't. And so that's a really important point. I want to add just like one more layer to this before we move on to the next discussion. Heather, you co-authored a report a few years ago that examined the connection between water and energy and how that fits into the state's effort to reduce emissions. Could you just explain for us like why it's so important to maintain healthy groundwater levels and kind of avoid the overpumping that is at this nexus?
Yeah, so been working on the issue of sort of water energy and the water energy nexus for a number of years. And first, I think, it's important for people to recognize, yes, when we talk about water energy, we use water for hydropower generation and for other types of energy generation. But water, the capturing, conveying, treating of wastewater, distributing on agricultural land uses a tremendous amount of energy. In fact, about 20% of the state's electricity is for water, and about a third of our natural gas use is also for water. So, and diesel fuel as well. So there is a huge connection between water and energy. And so what we try to look at is what's that connection between water, energy, and greenhouse gases, and what does it look like into the future? And so we did some scenarios out into the future, both for urban and agricultural, and found that we can dramatically cut our energy use and greenhouse gas emissions through water conservation and efficiency. That is going to be key for us in trying to meet not only our water goals, but also our energy and climate goals. As part of this work, we looked at around agriculture, and I know we talked about, agriculture uses about 4 times as much water as the urban sector. It's really the urban sector that's 9 times more energy intensive and greenhouse gas intensive. So if you're thinking about this through more of an energy lens, the focus really is on the urban sector. That being said, to your question around declining groundwater levels, as those groundwater levels decline, agriculture has to use more and more energy to find that water to the surface. So there's a potential energy opportunity in savings and try to stop that continuous decline, which we're going to have to do under state law now. But there's an energy savings opportunity there. And with recharge as well, as we're able to elevate those, that becomes an opportunity for energy savings. So these are going to be really critical too, because we talked about climate change is a driver for all of the challenges we're having. It's not the only issue, but it's a big issue and it's going to get worse. And so as we look to solutions, we have to think about reducing our energy use, greenhouse gas emissions, and water is certainly part of that solution.
Yeah, Greg, you have a thread on that?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that the 2 big sources, sort of new sources of water that people talk about, I talk about, for urban areas, recycling and desalination are incredibly energy intensive. I'm actually not so worried about that because I think the energy utilities are moving and they're mandated to move toward cleaner and cleaner sources. In terms of emissions, it certainly matters, but if they energy utilities meet their targets, I don't think it matters so much in that respect, but it certainly still matters in the cost, and the cost of energy is probably going to go up on the cost of water, given the way that the energy utilities are mandated to meet climate goals.
Yeah, you mentioned desalination. I want to go there for a second. So California has at least a dozen plants now, and the state is making some pretty hefty investments in bringing some of the state's biggest environmental agencies together to try and streamline projects to make this kind of once left field idea a major part of the governor's strategy. Last year, the Coastal Commission decided the fate of two controversial projects, approving one in Orange County, and then turning down a $1.4 billion project in Huntington Beach that had been going on for almost 2 decades. And so, Greg, I know you followed these two closely. I mean, what, if anything, can we distill from those two decisions?
Yeah, I think the bottom line in the end that no one likes to hear is it's very context specific. And I think to back up, the decision to reject one desal plant 30 miles down the coast from another in Orange County reflects that there's 3,000 water systems in the state. And to a large extent, except if you have a metropolitan or a San Diego County Water Authority, they're on their own and they rely on very different sources. They have very different situations in terms of the sources they rely on. So with respect to the Huntington Beach versus the South Coast plants, again, the 30 miles separated on the coast in Orange County, I think a lot of the decision was about the environmental impacts, where there was a pretty clear-cut advantage for the South Coast plant, but also about the relative need for that water in those two places, as well as the third factor really being the difference in ownership and the difference in expected cost. But those factors vary across all the big cases that you see. And there is just going to be continued complexity, I will also say, because all of the estimates around cost are projections. And the price of imported water is rising. The projection for desal always get exceeded when we actually build the plants. And recycling, the big investments also are estimated, but fall somewhere in between those sources generally. And they're all going to continue to vary as we see imported sources affected. And again, the price of energy is going to be sort of a factor that we can't fully anticipate in terms of its direction.
Yeah. Alvar, the governor wants to expand brackish groundwater desalination by 28,000 acre feet by the end of the decade. And for those unfamiliar, brackish water is like a semi-salty water that occurs naturally in rivers and estuaries. So his administration pitched in $5 million to help a Fresno County effort that would help some pretty desperate San Joaquin Valley communities. Given the realities of groundwater systems, is desalination a worthwhile investment in more inland areas?
So actually, this is a really interesting question. I think not many people know that first desalination plant in California was an inland plant with brackish desalination and was oriented to agriculture. It was in 1966, I think, or around that time. The benefits of inland or brackish desalination, it's cheaper. Brackish water, it's groundwater has more salt than that fresh water, but it's much less saltier than ocean water. So it's much easier to do. I mean, it's less costly, less energy intensive, and you can do it. Still, it may be expensive. Actually, here in Southern California, we do a lot of brackish desalination for urban uses. So, and also for ag. It's an option. There's as well as Greg was mentioning, all of this is context specific. So you are going to see what do you do with your brine, with the environmental impacts that it's causing. And in the San Joaquin Valley, what you were asking, there's some places actually that salinity is increasing so much that plants can't actually take that water. Mm. So if they want to keep growing, they have actually to do this desalination. And it's expensive, and what the good things also for both inland and seawater, there's a lot of new technologies going, and I think that this is going to keep improving. It will still be more expensive than surface water, or maybe from natural groundwater, but we are getting to a point where we have to look at every option, and that's what's happening in these places. I wanted just to make a final comment also on Greg's. I think he made a really great statements. We sometimes hear this point on, why we do seawater desalination, for example, if it's so expensive. And, San Diego is a really good place to talk about this. Seawater desalination, it's, why do we do insurances? Seawater desalination can be thought as an insurance. You are paying a really high rate for something that is really rare to happen, but it can happen. And especially in places like San Diego, you could get no state water project, no Colorado water. So what do you do? I mean, seawater is not the major source of San Diego, but I'm just saying that getting to Greg's point, it's context specific, this kind of fake truths on, seawater desalination is always bad or always good or something. So no, that's not how it works in California. California is really complex. There's many different systems, and many times there's reasons for the things that we do.
Yeah, Heather, go for it.
Yeah, just chiming in on sort of desalination, the idea of sort of looking at what's available locally. I mean, seawater desalination tends to be the most expensive supply. It's energy intensive. That's one of the reasons for the higher cost, one of the key reasons. But then you also have to deal with the brine and the intake. Those have impacts on our marine environment. So, the impacts are there. I think, though, communities really need, and it is a reliable supply, and that is important. People are often willing to pay a little more for a reliable supply.
Right.
The value for that benefit, but it's not infinite. I think that's important. And the industry, the community hasn't done a great job in trying to understand how much more should we be paying for reliable supply. But when I've looked at our work that we've done around the state, is what we find is that many communities have far cheaper options available to them that they should invest in first. Water conservation and efficiency, we talked a bit about it. If you look at the cost, it's not free. I want to put that to dispel that myth. There is a cost for efficiency. When you go to buy a clothes washer, the more efficiency, right, does cost more. But as you look at the savings and the benefits over the life, it's far cheaper for that additional cost for efficiency than it is for some of these supply, for many of these supply options. So conservation and efficiency, we've done a lot. There's a lot more we can do, particularly if we look outside and get bonds and transforming those. In addition, recycled water, also more expensive, but in many communities, we're using about 25% of the wastewater that we use. We're using it once and then we're discharging it. We could be doing a lot more recycling. It's less expensive to even seawater desalination. And I would even argue, if you're going to go to the trouble of seawater desalination, you don't want to use that water once. You want to use that water as many times as you can to really get the value. So I do think we do need to think about the local context. We also need to develop these in a way that sort of makes economic sense and will help to support.
Yeah, and I appreciate that you're alluding to reuse and recycling, because that's where we want to go next. But before we do, you've been researching desalination for almost 2 decades now, right? And so I'm just curious, could you just put into context how this conversation has changed over time and why it's suddenly garnering so much money and interest and political, attention?
Yeah, so I have been following. We did our first study on this back in 2006. It was when it came out. We worked on it longer. At that time, there were about 21 proposed plants up and down the coast. Of those, about 1 or 2 have been built. There was a lot of interest at the time. There was some numbers floating around that it was going to be cheap. It was $1,200 an acre foot. To give you context, I think San Diego's playing about $3,000 an acre foot. So the costs that were floating around were inaccurate. Let's to your earlier point about estimates. And there was just a lot of excitement, right? Oh, well, the cost of imported water is going up. This is cheaper. Once people started digging into it, they realized, it's actually not that cheap. It's quite expensive. And there's other options and cheaper options. So, many of those proposed plants, again, those 21 plants at that time, were really put on hold. Agencies started continuing on some of these cheaper alternatives. And when we look now, yes, Carlsbad, large 50 million gallon, largest in North America, that was built There's been some decisions on other ones, and whether or not those go through, we don't know. We don't know,
Right.
first of all, even once it's approved. But the conversation has changed quite a bit. I think though there is still this tendency to think that it's the silver bullet. That we have this coast, we have a lot of it up and down the state. Why don't we just tap it? But as we said, it's expensive. There's lots of other options we should be pursuing first.
Yeah.
So I think there's much broader range.
Yeah. So I want to share a few numbers with the room because October 1st marked the end of the water year. So statewide, California saw 141% of its average rainfall. The state received more than 33.5 inches of rain. That was nearly twice the amount of rain recorded during the previous water year and nearly 3 times the amount from the year prior. It was a miracle year in every sense after 3 of our driest years in recorded history. So naturally, stormwater capture was on so many people's water bingo card this year. Heather, I want to start with you again on this one. Can you just briefly explain for folks like what they're referring to when they're talking about stormwater capture and what your research has laid out in terms of its potential?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and thank you for asking. We, as was noted, released a study just last year looking at urban runoff and stormwater capture and what the opportunities are. You know, historically, we've urbanized areas. We've looked at sort of stormwater as a liability, and we've designed our cities to sort of get that water out as quickly as possible to avoid flood risk. And though what we did in that was created water quality issues, right? Where all of that stormwater has other things in it that we're now dumping into our oceans, into our rivers and streams. There has been some recognition over the past 10, 15 years that stormwater is an asset. It's something that we keep using, capturing, and using as a supply for those times when we don't have water, for those times of the year or for years. And so we're increasingly seeing investments in ways to capture that water, slow it down, infiltrate it into groundwater as one example, and then pump it out, treat it, and use it again. We did some estimate, and so it's looking at really at rainwater that's happening on sort of these hard surfaces in urban areas. So what's happening on roads, on rooftops, that's what we mean by urban. It's trying to capture some of that. In the region, in fact, Los Angeles is making some pretty significant investments in stormwater capture. There was a parcel tax that was passed a number of years ago, Measure W, and now the city and the county are looking at ways to take that water and address water quality issues and flood risk issues, but also to start to recharge groundwater. Through those projects, they are not only helping to augment supply, they're creating parks in neighborhoods that have not had them, improving water quality. So there are many sort of co-benefits of that. We've identified in our research a lot of opportunity to be augmenting supply through stormwater capture, particularly in our coastal areas where a lot of that is just running off.
Yeah, Greg, I know you mentioned kind of the cost estimates of desalination and kind of how stormwater capture can be a much more cost-effective alternative. What do you think is holding the solution back to being adopted more widely around the state?
Yeah, I think there's a number of factors. One, again, is like Heather said, we basically designed our cities to get stormwater out of them as quickly as possible for the longest time. So it's difficult with all the paved surfaces we have to capture stormwater. But the second is that we have to first with stormwater. We still have to be concerned about flooding, especially with more extreme precipitation events. Then the whole regulatory structure for stormwater is all about water quality. And cities basically have an unfunded mandate to comply with those requirements. And because of Proposition 218 here, it's hard to set up a stormwater utility. So they don't have much money to do the work. So that's where it comes in. You need basically folks like has been done in LA County to pass a tax on themselves to put enough money into a system that can actually invest in more stormwater capture than just the bare minimum to not be out of compliance with very wonky permits. So I'd also say actually, and I don't know, Heather will agree with me on this, in some ways I think stormwater, its ability to increase water supply is being hampered, or the waters are becoming muddied because people want so much from stormwater now. So multi-benefits part of stormwater is definitely true. Stormwater projects can bring multiple benefits, but not every single project can address water quality, increase water supply, increase greening, be a park, help with cooling, have native habitat. And that's some of the rhetoric that gets thrown out. And I think we just need to be clear about what our goals are and measure them. And otherwise, there's just frustration, I feel like, from everyone, even in the context of LA's program. So if we really want to focus on water supply, let's have metrics around water supply and acknowledge that in some cases, we can also have a park in a particular area. But I think we need to do a better job. Again, saying there's multiple benefits, but saying there's trade-offs in particular projects and being honest about that.
Right. Yeah. Because there were so many people in like the political context here just lamenting how much water was lost to the ocean, right? It was this thing we heard constantly. Alvar, there are also environmental benefits, yes?
Yeah, of course. I mean, we were talking here about urban, we usually differentiate between stormwater capture in urban environments in cities, and then we talk about groundwater recharge in ag environments. Groundwater recharge can have a lot of stormwater capture can have environmental benefits. Groundwater recharge can have a lot of environmental benefits. There's some places in the state where they are combining groundwater recharge basins with, we have the Pacific Flyway, where we have a lot of birds coming through California. And so if you have a groundwater recharge basin, you can actually combine these benefits. And actually, just bringing up to the previous conversation, I would bring also that the groundwater recharge is the biggest hope especially for California farms. It's the most affordable, or one of the most affordable supply options. As I was saying earlier, you can actually use your own irrigation ditches, canals, and all that to bring water in during winter times. And as we have seen that there's a lot of water that could be actually put into the aquifers, helping a lot with supply options. Actually, this year was so wet that a lot of effort, even though we did a lot of efforts, there was a lot of water that couldn't be captured because everything was wet. And actually, I was talking to someone from Metropolitan this week, and they had 500,000 acre feet they couldn't put anywhere. And one thing that we have to explore more, and I think that it's being starting, a lot of conversations, partnerships between, across agencies here in Southern California, in the Central Valley, that can have, we have the statewide project that connect the San Joaquin Valley and Southern California. So parking the water there, but there's still a lot of limitations on where you can actually move the water out of the state water project contractors. Also, there's infrastructure limitations, and there's also regulatory constraints. This year, we have this executive order. I think it was April. I don't remember exactly. But before that, it's really difficult to get a permit to put groundwater recharge. And same for urban. There's a lot of environmental issues that you have to take care of because we have to take care of these issues. But trying to streamline as possible all these groundwater recharge permits is really important for the state.
Yeah, so we're getting close to the question part, and there is a question that someone actually asked about. The governor supports streamlining the permitting for these kind of climate resilient projects. Is that something that you guys support for groundwater recharge projects and other climate resilient projects? Like, is that just kind of a foregone conclusion in terms of that's something we need to do, or is there kind of a trade-off there that needs to be considered? Heather, do you want to start with that one?
Started and then perspective on this. I mean, I think there is a challenge. Sometimes streamlining is sort of code for not considering all of the impacts.
Yeah.
And particularly for the environment. So, it does give me pause when I hear that at times. Yes, I think there are ways we can do things better and more efficiently, but it's often code for let's just fast track projects. And sometimes it ends up with bad projects that would have been rejected had we gone through. I do think, part of our challenge is we haven't been planning and doing enough. I mean, I think groundwater recharge is a great example where we're designing all in a lot of ways. We should have been doing this for decades in terms of identifying what are the best areas for recharge. How do we have infrastructure to get it there? Site infrastructure. We haven't done that level of planning yet, and I think that's going to be critical rather than construction streamline. Whoever can get it in the fastest is the best. It's not going to get us.
Yeah, Greg, I saw you furrowing your brow a little bit. Is your sentiment similar to that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what climate proposals you're talking about because that's my job for research. So I'd have to go case by case. I would say, I mean, I agree with what Heather's saying completely, but I would also say we're too slow at building water projects once we've approved them. We're too slow at deciding certain projects, including desal projects. I just, there's so much time and money wasted in 20-year debates. We got to get a little faster, at least deciding. I'm not saying approving, but deciding on these projects. And I know that's a common theme with housing too. That being said, I think all the agencies say they're working on it, so it's a little unclear how to move forward. The governor's trying to push it, but ultimately it's implemented at the agency level, and there seems to be common frustration and theme there. And we have to thread the needle between not overriding necessary regulations and caution and due process, but also speeding things up. It particularly applies to drinking water projects in small rural communities where everyone agrees we should build this new treatment plant and it takes 10 years. It's just unacceptable. People don't have clean water.
Right.
It applies in many other places, certainly with housing as well.
Yeah, this was also an interesting question too from the audience. So they're talking about transitioning from farming. Is there any example of a region in the U.S. where we've maybe government or society at large has like successfully over-relied on extraction and they were able to move to a new form of success? And that's their wording, not mine.
This is a really good question because I don't think that there are many success stories. And actually, there are some really bad stories in the past. Actually, we are right. I'm working with someone on working on transitions and looking a little bit at the historical perspective in the US. And we are, try to putting this in context. This is not the first thing that happens to humanity. We have seen this in many sectors, like coal mining, like other kind of issues. Our economy moves and transforms, and we have to adapt. And the bad thing is when we don't manage this transition. So what we are saying now is we have 20 years to actually plan for a managed transition and to do something that makes sense for everyone and doesn't cause big troubles for small communities, for vulnerable people, and also for farmers that are actually helping the economy of California. So I don't have it on top of my mind really good examples, but what I've seen, 2 weeks ago, I was in Fresno in a conference, and we had a lot of meetings with people, and I'm constantly working with a lot of the farmers community. There's a lot of momentum, energy, and things are, the mindset has changed a lot in 5-6 years. 5-6 years ago, nobody thought about regulating the water, going down in water use, and now there's following programs, there's multi-benefit programs in the state. It's actually getting some money out to start triggering that. And actually the farmers, the irrigation districts, the communities are working together to this transformation. So I think that we could be a good pilot case for other cases in the future.
Yeah. Heather, Greg, have you guys seen any, or are there any examples, maybe not necessarily in the US, where they've been able to kind of do a transition like this?
I do not.
I guess, we're supposed to be the positive panelists for reminders. No, I mean, I see a lot of successes happening around the state, frankly, in terms of with respect to water. I mean, we talked about the fact that we've continued to grow in the state and are using less water. That's a success. Absolutely. The fact that, we have far more recycled water than we used to, it's not enough. We need to do more, but if you look at, Orange County is a great example where they have been expanding their recycled water, using it, or treating it. For those that may not know, they're treating it to a very high quality, putting it underground, and then pumping it out again, treating it again, and then using it for drinking water for all those purposes. So I think there are a lot of good things happening, and really our challenge is to accelerate them, to do more. There are absolutely agricultural communities that have been able, as you noted, to produce higher yields with less water. So, I do think there are lots of successes and things to build on, and we are in this transition. We are seeing where we need to go. A lot of old institutions and sort of inertia. It's not going to be easy, but there's a lot of innovation that's happening elsewhere. So I think we have a lot to be proud of it.
Yeah, if we're just talking about positive things, I do want to mention, I think the most positive development in California into space the last few years is we're making these investments in water recycling in the major metros, including San Diego. San Diego there seems to be the most disagreement about certain aspects of that project, but Orange County has done it forever. LA is making 3 to 4 massive investments in recycling that will really change the supply equation, and other similar investments are being made in the Bay Area, not quite at the same scale. I think we need to do more, but I'm thrilled that we've overcome the narrative that water recycling is somehow not safe, because it's been proven to be safe, and we're moving toward the long-term direct potable recycling, which will cut out a step and allow us to be a little more efficient in space. So I'm really excited for that. We need to see more, but that's a huge development. I'd say that's positive.
Yeah, I mean, if the audience doesn't mind, if I squeeze one more question that's not from the audience, and I do want to spend a second talking about recycling, because toilet to tap is a term that kind of sort of poorly describes what that is. But when we're talking about wastewater recycling and the role that can play in both the urban environment and in agriculture, it seems like it's starting to, like desalination has very quickly come into the consciousness in a way that people are really paying attention to. Greg, you were alluding to a couple different efforts in LA and the Bay Area. Would you mind just kind of quickly detailing those and sort of what is happening in those two areas?
In LA specifically?
Yeah, and the Bay.
I'm not sure I could name the Bay.
Just do LA.
LA, yeah. Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, which serves the city of LA, is investing in Operation Next at its treatment plant at Hyperion on the coast, and then Metropolitan Water District is partnering with a few other entities in its pure water recycling project out of Carson, and then know at least, including with the LA Sanitation District. And then Los Virgenes Water District, which is kind of up in the hills in West LA near Malibu, is running its own project. I expect to see more, and we do need to see more coordination around those projects between the agencies. But I believe collectively, the estimated investment there is $20 billion. And again, it's really going to change the region's liability and existing reliance on imported water and be positive for the region.
Yeah, and I'll just add too, on one of the Southern California, one of the metropolitan projects, they are, at least as of now, partnering with Arizona and Nevada on that project, which is another really interesting innovation, right? So I'll just quickly get into it. Obviously, those 3 entities all rely on water from the Colorado River. And so Arizona and Nevada are interested in investing in a project in California and reduce Met's reliance on Colorado, which then frees up some of them. So another, in addition to, of course, it being recycled water and all the innovation there, I think there's a partnership innovation and something we can be thinking about in northern to southern California or in urban to ag. Just kind of breaking down, I think, some of the silos that we had. In the Bay Area, and I'm assuming in San Francisco Bay Area.
Yes.
They haven't been doing as much, frankly, in recycled water, only recycling about 5% of their wastewater there. Though that is going to be changing. In part, the driver there, or at least the initial driver for that, is because of concerns about nutrients in the San Francisco Bay Area. We had a terrible algal bloom last year that led to a really massive fish kill. Now, lots of different factors around the cause of that. Certainly wastewater, treated wastewater is contributing quite a bit to the bay. So that's likely to be the more urgent driver, although obviously this is a supply and helps us improve. And California, the Bay Area too, much it's a surprise, is heavily reliant on imported water from the Sierras. I know we don't talk about it that much. We like to point the finger at Southern California and the Bay Area as well. And so that recycled water, again, driven by water quality concerns, these supplies enable us to get off imported water, which is also the biggest challenge.
Yeah, and another interesting question here too. So a byproduct of conservation is lower sales and thus lost revenue. Where does the lost revenue come from to cover the fixed costs of water treatment and delivery to the consumer?
Yeah, let me jump in on that. It's an issue I'm really passionate about. I think, and this was talked about earlier, of this sort of new business model, and I think we have to recognize that lost revenue is also cost savings for customers there as well. And I think we need to, recognize that utilities are serving the community, and we need to be thinking about it from a larger perspective. When we look, and there've been a number of studies, when we look at efficiency, by investing in efficiency, we're avoiding the need to develop more expensive new supplies. So there is a cost savings there for the community. And in fact, a study that was done looking at Los Angeles in particular, within 16-year period, they saved the equivalent of $11 billion in new water treatment infrastructure through their efficiency.
Wow.
Similar savings on wastewater as well. That's a huge cost savings that then passed on to enable their customer bills to be 25% of what they were. So, I do think we need to do a better job of planning and forecasting, so that utilities aren't investing in new supply that they then don't use in is there. And I think that's a better solution. Another, I think, challenge with efficiency, and one of the reasons we haven't seen the investment in it that we have, say, in other infrastructure, is that, for other forms of infrastructure, recycled water, even desalination, we're debt financing, we're taking out bonds to pay for that. That enables us to help cover those high costs, even while those infrastructure benefits for a long time, much like we do. Right? We have not been paying for efficiency enough. Paying it out of operating expenses. And so in order for us to really scale and get the kind of investment those efficiencies, I think that'll help reduce the cost and concerns.
Yeah, Alvar.
Yeah, I wanted to add a little bit. I totally agree with what Heather was mentioning, especially with the part on if you have to expand supplies, and you have always to consider all the alternatives, and there's options. There's nuances also. There's places, for example, conservation in San Francisco is much more expensive than conservation here. In San Francisco, there's not a lot of outdoor use. It's just Central Coast. Central Coast is doing now like 50 gallons per capita per day or 60 gallons per capita per day in some places. So conservation there is expensive. It's just we have to consider all the options if you have other supplies. Then getting back to the first comment, you started with a conversation in the beginning that we had this week, a hearing. So then we get into the problem of is that the right thing to do for all the agencies in the state? So do we have to do that? And there's places where they don't need new supplies. So they have their base. We want these agencies to save water. Maybe yes. What are we going to do with this water? Are we going to send it to other place? We have all to think of all options that are on the table. Yeah, and finally, I wanted to add one more thing. And there's always nuances in everything, and we have to think about this carefully. What do we do with the water that we save? If we are doing conservation and we are adding population, we are actually increasing the vulnerability of our city. So if you understand how things go, you take lawns out, and then you put this water into new housing. When you have a drought, you won't be able to reduce water, and from outdoor use, and people have to reduce water from indoor use, which is much more expensive and problematic for people. Just saying that, have to be careful also what we do with the conservation water. We have to be, we have to have a plan in 5-10 years. What are we going to do with that? And try to also think about the increasing variability that we have year to year with climate change. So what urban agencies are asked to do, and they are doing well, in my opinion, is to develop plan for 4, 5, 6 year droughts, and what are they going to do in each of these years when they don't have enough water. So I think that this planning for supply and demand at the same time, and the variability that we have over these years, is the most important thing that you need to do on urban issues.
So before we go, I just want to ask you guys sort of one question. Imagine this perfect scenario where you have a blank check, majorities in both houses of the state legislature, and a governor ready to sign whatever idea you want to put forward. I'd love to hear just from each of you, like, what would that idea be? Greg, maybe start with you.
I haven't thought too much about that exact question because that's very far from my daily reality. I don't know. I think, I guess maybe I would think about others again putting big dollars, really big dollars into conservation. Again, I would be comfortable with the statewide ban on non-functional turf, but then putting dollars into conservation, particularly for low-income owners, to transition their lawns to native landscaping. But yeah, big dollars into conservation, outdoor use, as Alvar was saying, is really the problem. That would be one thing. I suppose another thing, and it's something I want to mention when Alvar was talking about it, like the $1 trillion question in California feels like, to me, where do we build new affordable housing that has enough water and isn't prone to fires? A really big problem intersecting those three things. So somehow there's a lot of money that could go toward that. That might actually be a better answer for me.
Yeah. Heather, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, I do think, I think obviously efficiency is a high priority, and I think I would sort of couple that, as Greg noted, with support for low-income households, those who haven't really been able to sort of participate in utility programs, and combining these projects with sort of widespread support for water affordability, for those households and communities that can't afford basic water service.
Yeah, Alvar?
I was actually going to go in similar direction, and we haven't talked.
Consensus.
We haven't talked. No, in Heather's last point, we haven't talked much today. But I think if I had this option, I would ask to ensure that every Californian has access to safe and clean water. And there's many people that don't have access.
Yeah.
And there's, especially in the Central Valley, especially in agricultural regions. So we have small communities that have really, systems that are in really bad conditions. And when we have droughts, they lose access to water. And actually, there've been studies out there that this is not an expensive thing. I mean, it's not like as expensive as many other things that we talk about.
Yeah.
So we are one of the, richest places in the world, and we shouldn't allow that to happen.
Yeah, I feel like that's a great place to end it. Can I get a round of applause for the panel? Yeah.